The sun was setting over a picturesque European city, casting golden hues across its ancient cobblestone streets and ornate buildings. Tourists from all corners of the globe wandered through the bustling square, marveling at the grandeur of the royal palace that stood proudly at its center. Among these travelers was Greg, an Australian man with a scruffy beard, a wide grin, and an unshakable love for adventure. Known among his friends as someone who could turn even the dullest moment into something memorable, Greg had already made quite the impression on this trip, though not always in the best way. Earlier that day, Greg had joined a group of fellow tourists exploring the city's landmarks. They visited towering cathedrals, wandered through charming markets, and snapped countless photos of historic statues. By late afternoon, they found themselves near the iconic palace, where royal guards stood watch outside the gates. These guards were famous for their stoic demeanor, standing perfectly still in their striking uniforms, bright red coats, gleaming buttons, and tall bearskin hats that seemed almost too large for their heads. To many visitors, they looked like living sculptures, part of the city's rich history rather than real people. Greg, however, saw them differently. To him, they were a challenge. He couldn't resist testing their legendary patience, though he hadn't yet figured out how. As the group paused to admire the palace, Greg excused himself, claiming he needed a quick pint before continuing the tour. His friends laughed knowingly. Greg wasn't exactly known for his restraint when it came to local brews. True to form, he ducked into a nearby pub, ordered a frothy beer, and struck up conversations with locals about everything from football to food. Before long, he'd downed more drinks than he cared to count, fueling his already mischievous spirit. Emerging from the pub slightly wobbly but full of energy, Greg stumbled back toward the palace square. The air buzzed with activity as street performers juggled fire torches, musicians played lively tunes, and vendors called out to passersby hawking snacks and souvenirs. It was here that inspiration struck, or perhaps bad judgment took over. Spotting a cart piled high with fresh eggs, Greg grinned mischievously. An idea began forming in his mind, one that would soon make him the center of attention, for better or worse. As he approached the egg vendor, Greg fished some coins from his pocket and bought 3 eggs. He turned them over in his hands, feeling their smooth shells and imagining what chaos he might unleash. At first, his friends tried to steer him away, sensing trouble brewing. But Greg brushed off their warnings with a laugh, insisting he just wanted to have a little fun. Little did anyone know, his antics were about to take a turn no one could have predicted, not even Greg himself. With 3 eggs cradled in his hands, Greg felt a surge of excitement mixed with the fuzzy confidence that only comes from having had one too many drinks. The crowd around him was lively, buzzing with laughter and chatter as street performers entertained nearby. A fire juggler twirled flaming batons high above his head, while a guitarist strummed a catchy tune that echoed through the square. It was the perfect backdrop for Greg's growing mischief, though no one, least of all Greg himself, knew just how far things would go. At first, he simply held the eggs up to inspect them, pretending to be some kind of culinary expert. "Ah, yes," he declared loudly, striking a pose like a chef on a cooking show. "These are grade A eggs, top-notch quality." His friends groaned but couldn't help laughing at his antics. Some tourists passing by stopped to watch, curious about what this oddball Australian might do next. Even a few locals paused, smirking at the strange scene unfolding before them. Feeling emboldened by the attention, Greg took it a step further. He began tossing one egg gently into the air, catching it with surprising skill despite his slightly unsteady stance. The small group watching him clapped and cheered, urging him to keep going. Embarrassed yet encouraged, Greg added a second egg to the mix, juggling them awkwardly but with enough charm to make people smile. By the time he threw the third egg into the rotation, he'd drawn a decent-sized audience. Kids giggled, adults laughed, and someone even started recording on their phone. But Greg wasn't satisfied with just entertaining the crowd. As he juggled the eggs higher and more dramatically, his gaze drifted toward the royal guards standing nearby. Their stoic presence loomed over the square, a stark contrast to the playful chaos surrounding them. Something about their unwavering posture intrigued and amused Greg. They looked so serious, so untouchable, like statues carved from stone. Surely they wouldn't react if he got a little closer, right? After all, everyone else seemed to be enjoying his performance. Ignoring the cautious murmurs from his friends, Greg began inching his way toward the guards, still juggling the eggs with increasing enthusiasm. Each toss grew bolder, each catch riskier, as if he were trying to prove something, not just to the crowd, but maybe to himself. People whispered warnings, telling him not to push his luck. One woman tugged at his sleeve, saying, "Mate, you're asking for trouble." But Greg waved her off with a dismissive laugh. "Relax," he said, slurring slightly. "They're human, aren't they? What's the worst that could happen?" As he drew nearer to the guards, the atmosphere shifted. The once cheerful energy became tinged with nervous anticipation. Some spectators stepped back, unsure whether to intervene or simply wait and see what would happen. Others leaned in eagerly, sensing that this moment might become something unforgettable. For the guards themselves, however, there was no change in demeanor. They stood tall and immovable, their eyes fixed straight ahead, seemingly oblivious to the drunk tourist now dangerously close to their line. And then, just as Greg prepared to throw the eggs even higher, to really show off, he stumbled ever so slightly. Time seemed to slow as one of the eggs slipped from his grasp, tumbling through the air in a graceful arc. Everyone froze, holding their breath, as the egg hurtled downward. Would it land harmlessly on the ground? Or would it strike its unintended target, the polished boot of a royal guard? No one dared blink as the answer hung precariously in the balance. The moment the egg left Greg's hand, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just surprise. It was disbelief, anticipation, and maybe even a hint of dread. Everyone seemed to move in slow motion as they watched the egg tumble through the air, its smooth shell glinting faintly in the fading sunlight. Some people instinctively covered their mouths, while others leaned forward, unable to look away. Even Greg froze mid-juggle, his arms still raised, as if hoping gravity might somehow reverse itself and spare him from the impending disaster. For a split second, it looked like the egg might miss its mark entirely. It wobbled slightly in its descent, veering just enough to give false hope that it would land harmlessly on the cobblestones instead. But fate had other plans. With an almost comical inevitability, the egg struck its target with a soft but unmistakable splat. The yolk spread across the gleaming black boot of one of the royal guards, leaving behind a sticky yellow streak that contrasted sharply with the otherwise pristine uniform. A hush fell over the square. The cheerful chatter and laughter that had filled the air moments earlier were abruptly silenced, replaced by an eerie stillness. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what would happen next. Some visitors whispered nervously among themselves, speculating about how the guard might react. Would he shout, demand Greg's arrest? Or worse, would reinforcements be called to deal with the unruly tourist? The tension was palpable, pressing down on everyone like a heavy blanket. Greg, now fully aware of the gravity of his actions, stood frozen in place. His initial shock quickly gave way to panic as reality set in. He glanced at the guard, then at the crushed egg on the man's boot, and finally at the growing crowd of onlookers. For once, his usual bravado deserted him. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. His face flushed red, not just from the alcohol, but from sheer embarrassment. This was not how he'd imagined his day ending. The guard, meanwhile, remained eerily calm. If he felt any irritation or anger, he didn't show it. Instead, he simply stared straight ahead, his posture unwavering, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. This only made the situation more surreal. Here was Greg, a disheveled, slightly drunk tourist, standing mere feet away from a symbol of discipline and authority. And yet there was no immediate reaction. No scolding, no threats, no movement whatsoever. It was as though the guard existed in a completely different world, untouched by the chaos around him. But the lack of response didn't ease the tension, it amplified it. The longer the silence stretched, the more uncomfortable everyone became. Greg's friends hovered nearby, torn between stepping in to defuse the situation and staying out of it altogether. One of them whispered urgently, "Just apologize. Greg, say something." But Greg couldn't find the words. His mind raced, trying to come up with some clever remark or apology that might salvage the moment. But all he could manage was a sheepish grin that came off as both awkward and inappropriate. Meanwhile, the crowd began to shift uneasily. Some people edged closer, eager to see how this bizarre standoff would resolve itself, while others took a few cautious steps back, wanting to distance themselves from potential trouble. Parents ushered their children away, sensing that things could escalate at any moment. Even the street performers who had been entertaining nearby packed up quietly and slipped into the background, unwilling to risk being caught in the crossfire. As the seconds ticked by, the weight of the situation bore down on Greg. He realized too late that his harmless prank had crossed a line, one he hadn't fully understood until now. These guards weren't just figures in fancy uniforms. They represented centuries of tradition, duty, and respect. And here he was, a clueless outsider, treating them like part of some ridiculous game. The enormity of his mistake hit him like a ton of bricks, and for the first time that day, Greg wished he could turn back the clock and undo everything. But it was too late. All he could do now was wait, and hope that the consequences wouldn't be as dire as they seemed. The silence that followed the egg's landing felt endless, stretching out like a tightrope strung between disaster and redemption. Everyone waited with bated breath, their eyes darting nervously between Greg and the guard whose boot now bore the unmistakable mark of yolk and shell. Time seemed to stand still as the crowd braced itself for what was surely going to be an explosive reaction. Surely this couldn't end well, not when royal guards were known for their strict adherence to protocol and discipline. But then something unexpected happened. Slowly, deliberately, the guard glanced down at his boot. The sticky mess glistened under the fading sunlight, a glaring reminder of Greg's drunken antics. Instead of snapping to attention or barking orders, however, the guard did something no one anticipated. He bent down. His movements were measured, almost ceremonial, as though he were performing some kind of ritual rather than addressing an embarrassing mishap. With gloved fingers, he picked up a shard of broken eggshell, holding it up to inspect it closely. For a moment, the absurdity of the situation hit everyone at once. Here was a towering figure in a regal uniform, stooping to examine a piece of cracked eggshell as if it were evidence in a high-stakes investigation. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the crowd, hesitant at first, but growing louder as people realized the guard wasn't angry, or at least, not outwardly so. Someone muttered, "Is he serious?" Another replied, "Maybe he thinks it's art." The tension began to crack, like ice melting under the warmth of spring. And then came the sound that changed everything, a soft chuckle. It was barely audible at first, almost drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd, but there it was, genuine amusement. The guard, who moments ago had seemed untouchable, was laughing. Not loudly or obnoxiously, but just enough to break the spell of intimidation that usually surrounded him. He shook his head slightly, glancing briefly at Greg before returning his gaze to the eggshell in his hand. To everyone watching, it was as if a dam had burst. The humanity behind the uniform shone through, transforming the imposing figure into someone relatable, even endearing. The ripple effect was immediate. One by one, the other guards standing nearby started showing signs of suppressed laughter. A younger guard stifled a grin behind his gloved hand, while another shifted uncomfortably, clearly fighting back a smile. Their rigid postures softened ever so slightly, betraying the fact that they were, after all, human beings with emotions. For years, these men had been trained to maintain composure in the face of anything, whether it was rowdy tourists, inclement weather, or even pigeons perching on their shoulders. But a drunk Australian juggling eggs, that was apparently too much for even them to handle without cracking a smile. Greg, who had been frozen in place since the egg landed, finally exhaled the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. At first, he wasn't sure how to interpret the guard's reaction. Was this some kind of trick? A calm before the storm scenario where the laughter would quickly turn into anger? But as the chuckles grew more pronounced and the surrounding guards joined in, Greg allowed himself to relax. His panic gave way to relief, and then to sheepish pride. Somehow, against all odds, he had managed to turn what should have been a mortifying incident into something oddly lighthearted. The crowd erupted into applause, breaking the remaining tension like a wave crashing against the shore. People cheered and whistled, clapping not just for Greg's ridiculous stunt, but also for the guard's remarkable restraint and good humor. Strangers patted Greg on the back, congratulating him for pulling off such an audacious feat. Even the street performers returned to their acts, energized by the sudden shift in atmosphere. What had begun as a potentially disastrous encounter had morphed into a shared moment of joy and connection, one that none of the witnesses would soon forget. As the applause died down, Greg took a tentative step forward, his earlier bravado replaced by humility. He looked at the guard, who was still inspecting the eggshell with mock seriousness, and offered a small, awkward wave. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice tinged with both apology and awe. The guard glanced up, his expression unreadable yet somehow kind. Without saying a word, he nodded slightly, acknowledging Greg's remorse and perhaps silently forgiving him for the intrusion. In that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual understanding that sometimes life throws curveballs, or eggs, your way, and the best response isn't always anger, it's grace. Encouraged by the guard's unexpected display of humor and humanity, Greg decided to take a step further, this time not out of mischief, but out of genuine remorse. He shuffled closer to the guard, his earlier bravado replaced by a sheepish awkwardness that made him seem more relatable than ridiculous. The crowd, still buzzing from the surreal turn of events, watched intently as Greg approached the man whose boot he had unwittingly turned into an impromptu breakfast tray. For once, Greg wasn't trying to entertain, he was trying to make amends. "Hey, mate," Greg began, his voice soft and hesitant, a stark contrast to his earlier boisterous tone. "I'm really sorry about, well, you know." He gestured vaguely toward the guard's boot, now adorned with streaks of yolk and tiny fragments of shell. Then, almost instinctively, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled napkin, the kind you'd find at any pub or food stall. Holding it out like a peace offering, he added, "Here, maybe this'll help." The guard looked at the napkin for a moment, then back at Greg. There was no hint of irritation in his expression, only a quiet amusement that seemed to say, "This guy is something else." With a slow nod, he accepted the napkin, though it was clear it wouldn't do much to clean up the mess. Still, the gesture mattered. It was a small act of apology, but it carried weight, a sign that Greg wasn't just brushing off the incident as a joke. He genuinely felt bad, and the guard appeared to appreciate that. What followed was perhaps the most surprising part of the entire ordeal, a conversation. Not a formal interrogation or a stern lecture, but an actual exchange between two people who couldn't have been more different. The guard, whose nameplate read Corporal Harris, asked Greg where he was from. When Greg replied, "Australia," Corporal Harris nodded knowingly. "Ah, I've heard it's beautiful there," he said, his tone warm and conversational. "Ever been to Sydney?" Greg blinked, momentarily stunned. Was this really happening? A royal guard, someone whose job literally involved standing still for hours, was making small talk with him. Shaking off his disbelief, Greg launched into an enthusiastic description of his hometown. See. As Greg and Corporal Harris continued their unlikely conversation, the atmosphere around them transformed from tense and awkward to warm and almost magical. The crowd, which had been content to simply watch the exchange, began to disperse slightly, giving the two men space, while still stealing glances and snapping photos. It was as if everyone sensed that this moment wasn't just about a clumsy tourist and a forgiving guard. It was about something deeper, a rare human connection forged in the most unexpected of circumstances. Greg, who only moments ago had been bracing himself for trouble, now found himself opening up in ways he hadn't planned. He told Corporal Harris about his travels, describing the vast red deserts of Australia, the vibrant cities, and even the quirky wildlife that always seemed to surprise visitors. "You should see the kangaroos," Greg said with a grin, his earlier nervousness melting away. "They're like nature's comedians, always hopping around like they've got somewhere important to be." Corporal Harris chuckled softly, clearly entertained by Greg's animated storytelling. "I've always wanted to visit," he admitted, "but standing here all day doesn't leave much time for adventures." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a wistful tone that suggested he thought about exploring the world beyond the palace gates more than once. The conversation shifted naturally, moving from travel stories to lighter topics. Greg asked about what it was like being a royal guard, how long they had to stand in one spot, whether they ever got bored, and if they were allowed to laugh when kids tried to make them crack a smile. Corporal Harris answered each question with good humor, sharing little anecdotes that painted a picture of life behind the stoic uniform. "Kids are the worst," he joked with a twinkle in his eye. "They'll do anything to get us to move, even pretend to faint." At one point, another guard leaned over slightly, his voice low but teasing. "Harris, you're supposed to look intimidating, not chatty." Corporal Harris shot him a playful glare before turning back to Greg. "Ignore him," he said with a shrug. "He's just jealous because I'm having all the fun." The interaction didn't go unnoticed by the onlookers. Some snapped photos, capturing the surreal scene of a scruffy Australian chatting casually with a royal guard. Others recorded videos, zooming in on Greg's animated gestures and Corporal Harris's subtle smiles. Social media feeds would soon light up with captions like, "When life gives you lemons," or "Eggs, you make friends," and proof that even guards have a sense of humor. For Greg, the encounter became a turning point in his trip. As the conversation wound down, he felt a pang of gratitude, not just for Corporal Harris's kindness, but for the reminder that people, no matter how different they seem, can connect through simple acts of understanding. Before stepping away, Greg extended his hand, unsure if shaking hands was allowed. To his relief, Corporal Harris accepted it firmly, giving a polite nod. "Take care, mate," Greg said sincerely. "And thanks for not arresting me." "You're welcome," Corporal Harris replied with a hint of amusement. "Just try not to juggle anything else near the palace, all right?" As Greg rejoined his friends, who greeted him with a mix of relief and disbelief, he couldn't stop smiling. The whole situation had gone from potentially disastrous to unexpectedly heartwarming. His friends teased him relentlessly, calling him the guy who made a guard laugh, and vowing to remind him of this story every time he got too cocky. But beneath the jokes, there was a shared appreciation for what had happened, a reminder that sometimes breaking the ice or dropping an egg can lead to moments of genuine connection. Back at his hotel later that night, Greg sat on the edge of his bed, replaying the day's events in his mind. He realized that his drunken stunt had taught him something valuable. Respect isn't just about following rules. It's also about recognizing the humanity in others and being willing to own up when you mess up. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, Greg knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't just be a funny story to tell his mates back home. It would be a lesson he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. The next morning, Greg woke up with a mix of feelings: relief, pride, and just a touch of embarrassment. As he sipped his coffee on the balcony of his hotel room, Overlooking the same cobblestone streets where the egg incident had unfolded, he couldn't help but replay the events in his mind. The memory of Corporal Harris's unexpected chuckle still brought a smile to his face, but it was accompanied by a deeper sense of reflection. For the first time in years, Greg found himself thinking not just about the fun he'd had during his travels, but also about the impact of his actions, both good and bad. His friends were already downstairs, waiting for him in the lobby. They greeted him with playful jabs as soon as he walked in. "There he is, the legend himself," one of them teased, pretending to toss an invisible egg into the air. Another chimed in, "You know, we should put you on stage. You could be the world's first drunk juggler diplomat." Despite their ribbing, there was genuine admiration in their tone. Even they had been moved by how things turned out, though none of them would admit it outright. As the group set off to explore more of the city, Greg noticed that his perspective had shifted. Instead of rushing from one landmark to the next or seeking out the wildest experiences, he found himself slowing down, paying attention to the people around him. He struck up conversations with shopkeepers, listened intently to tour guides, and even offered to help a lost family find their way back to their hotel. It was as if the encounter with Corporal Harris had reminded him that travel wasn't just about seeing new places. It was about connecting with others and leaving a positive mark, no matter how small. That evening, over dinner at a cozy restaurant, Greg opened up to his friends about how the day before had affected him. At first, they assumed he was going to launch into another exaggerated retelling of the egg story, complete with sound effects and dramatic gestures. But instead, he surprised them by speaking candidly. "I messed up," he admitted, swirling his fork thoughtfully in his pasta. "I mean, yeah, it turned out okay in the end, but I crossed a line. Those guards have a job to do, and I treated it like some kind of game." His friends exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. This level of introspection wasn't typical for Greg, who usually brushed off mistakes with a laugh and a shrug. One of them finally spoke up. "Yeah, you did kind of push your luck," she said gently. "But look at what came out of it. You made people smile, including those guards. Isn't that worth something?" Greg nodded slowly, acknowledging her point. "It is," he agreed, "and I'm grateful for how understanding they were. But I think I needed this wake-up call. I've always prided myself on being the life of the party, the guy who can turn any moment into a story. But maybe sometimes I need to think about whether those stories are worth telling." The table fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then someone raised their glass. "To learning lessons the hard and hilarious way," they said with a grin. Everyone joined in, clinking glasses and laughing, but there was a newfound respect in the air. Greg's vulnerability had brought them closer together, reminding them that even the most carefree adventures could hold deeper meaning. Later that night, as Greg lay in bed scrolling through social media, he stumbled upon the video someone had posted of the egg incident. It had gone viral, racking up thousands of likes and comments. People praised Corporal Harris's professionalism and humor, while others joked about Greg's juggling skills, or lack thereof. Scrolling through the comments, Greg felt a swell of gratitude, not just for the kindness shown by the guards, but for the reminder that humanity thrives on moments of connection, however accidental they may be. By the time he drifted off to sleep, Greg knew he'd carry the lessons of that day with him forever. What started as a reckless act born out of intoxication had become a turning point, a reminder that even when you trip over your own mistakes, there's always a chance to stand back up, apologize sincerely, and learn something valuable along the way. And perhaps, just perhaps, make a friend in the process. By the time Greg returned home to Australia, the egg juggling incident had become a global sensation. The video of him juggling eggs near the Royal Guards, and their unexpected reaction, had been shared millions of times across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story, dubbing it "the day a drunk tourist brought humanity to Royal Guards." Memes popped up everywhere, some poking fun at Greg's antics, others celebrating the guard's professionalism and humor. People couldn't get enough of the unlikely tale, and Greg found himself thrust into an odd kind of fame. At first, he wasn't sure how to handle it. Friends and family bombarded him with messages, asking for details about what happened. Strangers approached him in cafes or grocery stores, saying things like, "Hey, aren't you the guy who threw an egg at a guard?" Local news stations even called, hoping to interview him. While Greg was flattered by the attention, he also felt a responsibility to tell the story right. Not as a boastful recounting of his wild behavior, but as a lesson about humility, respect, and the power of human connection. He decided to share his side of the story on social media, writing a heartfelt post that quickly went viral. In it, he admitted his mistakes, acknowledging that his actions could have ended badly if not for the guard's grace under pressure. "I got lucky," he wrote. "Instead of getting angry, those men chose to see the humor in the situation and treat me with kindness. That moment taught me something I'll never forget. No matter where you go or what you do, we're all just people trying our best. And sometimes, breaking the rules can lead to moments of understanding instead of chaos." The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories of times they'd messed up and been met with unexpected forgiveness. Teachers used the story in classrooms to talk about empathy and accountability. Tour companies referenced it in blogs, reminding travelers to respect local customs while still embracing spontaneity. Even Corporal Harris became something of a celebrity. Photos of him standing stoically outside the palace began circulating online, accompanied by captions like "the guard who laughed" and proof that discipline can coexist with humor. Greg stayed in touch with Corporal Harris through occasional emails facilitated by the palace's public relations team. Their exchanges were brief but meaningful, filled with updates about life and lighthearted jokes. Once, Greg sent a care package containing Australian souvenirs, a boomerang, some Vegemite, and a t-shirt that read, "Sorry about the egg incident." Corporal Harris replied with a photo of himself holding the items, wearing the shirt under his uniform jacket. The image made Greg laugh until tears streamed down his face. Over time, Greg noticed changes in himself. He became more mindful of his actions, especially when traveling. Gone were the days of reckless stunts aimed solely at entertaining himself or impressing others. Instead, he focused on making genuine connections, whether it was chatting with a street vendor in Thailand, helping a lost tourist find their way in Italy, or simply taking the time to learn about the history and culture of the places he visited. His friends teased him, calling him the reformed adventurer, but they admired the shift in his attitude. Years later, when Greg looked back on his travels, the egg incident remained one of his favorite stories, not because it was funny or embarrassing, but because it changed him. It reminded him that life is unpredictable, full of moments that can either divide us or bring us closer together. And sometimes, all it takes is a little humility, and maybe a cracked egg, to remind us of our shared humanity. To this day, whenever Greg tells the story to new audiences, he ends with the same piece of advice. Travel with an open heart and a curious mind. Be respectful, even when you're having fun. And remember, if you ever find yourself juggling eggs near a royal guard, well, let's just say I've already claimed that one. His listeners always laugh, but they leave inspired, ready to create their own unforgettable, and hopefully less messy, adventures.